They said her father sold her for a hunting rifle and 3 sacks of flour. A 16-year-old girl, weighed and found wanting, traded like cattle on the dusty steps of the general store. The town of Whetstone watched as the wagon carrying her vanished into the mountains, and they figured she was gone for good, discarded, forgotten. But up in those high, lonely places, behind the door of a cabin where the fire never dies, something was waiting. The mountain man who took her, Gideon Maddox, he wasn't what he seemed, not even close. And the girl they all gave up on, Delilah? She was about to pull a thread that would unravel a truth so dark and deep it would shake the entire valley to its core. When the past comes crawling out of its grave and the cold winds of judgment blow down from the peaks, you have to ask yourself one question. Who was really saved that day? And who was judged far, far too soon? The spring sun was a hammer beating down on the streets of Whetstone, but Jed Boone's voice was hotter. His big, calloused hand was a vice on Delilah's arm, bruising the flesh as he dragged her toward the general store. "Time's up," he roared, his voice thick with rage and corn liquor. "I've had enough of this dead weight." Delilah stumbled on the wooden steps, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like it could peel the skin from her face. Townsfolk were starting to gather, their faces a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Her plain dress was wrinkled, her dark hair coming loose from its braid. She kept her eyes locked on the weathered floorboards, trying to shrink, to disappear, even as her father made her the center of everyone's world. "Hear me now!" Jed bellowed to the crowd, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "I'm offering up this girl, my own flesh and blood, in exchange for a good hunting rifle and 3 sacks of flour." He shook her, the motion rattling her teeth. "She's strong enough for work, if anyone's willing to break her of her lazy ways." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating. Delilah could hear her own breath, ragged and fast. She could feel the stares of people she'd known her whole life, people who were now watching her be sold like a piece of livestock. The bell over the store's door tinkled, but she didn't dare look up. "She's 16 now," Jed continued, his disgust a physical thing in the air. "And I'm done trying to toughen her up. It's time she learned what real suffering is." That's when heavy bootsteps creaked on the porch boards. A long shadow fell over Delilah, blocking out the cruel sun. "I'll make that trade." The voice was quiet, but it had the weight of mountain granite. It cut through the morning heat and Jed's loudmouth pronouncements. Delilah's head snapped up. It was Gideon Maddox, the mountain man. He only came to town a few times a year, a silent figure who bought his supplies and disappeared back into the hills. His beard was shot through with gray, his clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes held nothing. Not cruelty, not kindness. Just a deep, unnerving stillness. Jed blinked, surprised. "Well now, Maddox, didn't figure you'd be interested. You sure about this?" "I said I'll make the trade," Gideon repeated, his voice unchanged. "My rifle's in good condition. I'll fetch the flour, too." He gestured with his chin toward his wagon, waiting at the bottom of the steps. Jed's grip on Delilah's arm finally loosened. "Done," he grunted, giving her a shove toward the mountain man. "She's your problem now." The deal was done with a speed that stole Delilah's breath. She stood frozen as Maddox retrieved a beautiful, well-oiled rifle and a box of ammunition from his wagon, then hauled 3 heavy sacks of flour onto the store's porch. Her father inspected the weapon with more tenderness than he'd ever shown her, sighting down the barrel, testing its action. "Fair trade," Jed declared. He turned, looked at Delilah, and spat in the dust near her feet. "You'll learn about suffering up there, girl. Might finally make something of you." And then he was gone. He walked away, cradling the rifle without a single backward glance. The crowd started to melt away, their whispers following her like biting flies. Delilah stood trembling, an island in a sea of judgment. "Come on, then," Maddox said quietly. He didn't touch her. He just gestured toward the wagon. "Long ride ahead." She followed him on legs that felt like they were made of jelly. The wagon was loaded with supplies, barrels, feed sacks, tools. He helped her up onto the hard wooden seat. Then he reached into a bag and pulled out a rough wool blanket and half a loaf of bread. "Might get cold," he said, offering them to her. "Eat if you're hungry." She took them, her fingers numb, clutching them to her chest like a shield. The bread smelled fresh, but her stomach was a tight, painful knot. Maddox climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the horses started forward. The wagon wheels rumbled, and they left Whetstone behind. Delilah stared straight ahead, refusing to look back at the only home she'd ever known. The mountains loomed before them, their peaks like jagged teeth against the sky. Her father's last words echoed in her head. Real suffering. She pulled the blanket tight, her mind a whirlwind of terror. What kind of man bought a girl for a rifle? What fate was waiting for her up in that cold, silent wilderness? Every bump and jolt of the wagon felt like it was taking her one step closer to hell. The trail grew steeper, the air colder. The sun bled out behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. Delilah's body ached from hours on the unforgiving wagon seat. Just as darkness began to swallow the landscape, Gideon pulled the horses into a small clearing, sheltered by towering pines. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice the first sound between them for hours. He climbed down and began unhitching the horses with an economy of movement that spoke of long practice. Delilah stayed put, a statue on the wagon seat, watching him. He fed the animals, gathered wood, and soon had a crackling fire pushing back the encroaching night. The cold was sinking into her bones now, a deep, invasive chill. "Best come down by the warmth," he said, looking up at her. "No sense freezing." Her muscles screamed in protest as she carefully climbed down. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat on a fallen log, keeping a careful distance from both the fire and the man. He didn't seem to notice or care. He put a pot of beans on to heat, and the smell of coffee soon filled the air. He filled a tin plate and a cup, walked over, and set them on the log beside her. Then he retreated to his own spot across the fire without a single word. She ate, forcing down small bites of the warm food, her eyes never leaving him. While she ate, he did something strange. He gathered a thick pile of pine boughs and lashed them together, creating a small, lean-to shelter a dozen yards from the fire. He laid a bedroll inside it. Then he came back to the fire and looked at her. "For privacy," he said, seeing her confusion, "you'll sleep there. I'll keep to this side of the fire." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. It was followed immediately by more confusion. This wasn't the behavior of a monster. But if he wasn't a monster, then what was he? What did he want with her? The questions circled in her mind, offering no answers, as she finally lay down in the makeshift shelter, the scent of pine all around her. They were on the trail again at first light. The wagon groaned and swayed, climbing higher and higher into the heart of the mountains. By mid-morning, they rounded a bend, and there it was, a weathered cabin tucked against a hillside, a clear stream bubbling nearby. A small chicken coop and a goat pen stood to one side. This was it, the place her suffering would begin. Gideon helped her down and led her to the door. "This is home," he said, pushing it open. The inside was simple, sparse but spotlessly clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy table and two chairs sat in the middle of the room. A ladder led to a loft above. "Kitchen's here," Gideon said, gesturing to the main room. "The loft will be your space. My room is through that door." He pointed to the cabin's only other door. Then he said the words that shattered every expectation she had. "You won't be expected to cook or clean for me. You won't be expected to serve me in any way." Delilah's eyes went wide. She stared at him, trying to find the trick, the lie. His face was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "This place is quiet," he said, his gaze drifting around the small room. "It's peace you need, girl, not penance." That night, lying in the loft on a comfortable straw mattress, tucked under several heavy quilts, the tears finally came. They were silent, hot tears that tracked down her temples into her hair. She cried for her father's cruelty, for the town that had watched and done nothing. But she also cried with a confusing, terrifying flicker of relief. She had been sold. She had been cast out. But as she fell asleep to the sound of the stream, a new and dangerous thought took root in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been condemned. Maybe she'd been saved. The days fell into a rhythm as gentle and steady as the stream outside the cabin. Each morning, Delilah would wake, pull on her boots, and tend to the goats. They learned the sound of her footsteps, pressing their heads against the fence, their soft bleats a greeting. She milked them, the warmth of the animals a comfort against the cool morning air. She gathered eggs from the chicken coop, the smooth brown shells feeling like treasures in her hands. Gideon showed her how to work the garden, how to turn the soil and plant neat rows of peas and beans. Her muscles, soft from a life her father called useless, ached and then grew strong. When she planted her first row all by herself, she saw Gideon watch from the porch, a slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. The mountain air was clean, scented with pine and sage. She found herself breathing deeper, the constant knot of tension in her shoulders, slowly beginning to unwind. One afternoon, while sweeping the loft, her broom hit something solid tucked under an old blanket. It was a trunk, dark wood, with brass fittings tarnished by age, and on the front, a heavy ornate lock. Her fingers traced the carvings on the lid, vines and flowers intricately woven. A powerful curiosity surged through her, a desire to know what secrets it held. But she pushed it down. This was his home. She had no right. She covered it back up. That evening by the fire, she gathered her courage. "Mr. Maddox," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "might I ask how you came to live up here, all alone?" His face changed. It was like watching a calm pond freeze over in an instant. The warmth from the fire seemed to recede from him. "Some things are best left buried, girl," he said, his voice clipped and cold. He stood up abruptly and walked outside into the darkness, leaving her alone with the crackling flames and 1,000 new questions. A week later, the quiet was broken by hoofbeats. A woman on a brown mare rode into the yard. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her saddlebags clinked with the sound of glass jars. "Miss Josie," Gideon said, coming out of his workshop, "didn't expect you." "Brought preserves," the woman said, swinging down from her horse. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, found Delilah standing in the cabin doorway. "And who might this be?" Gideon drew Miss Josie aside. They spoke in low tones, and Delilah saw the woman's expression shift from surprise to concern, and then to a kind of sad understanding. When they finished, Miss Josie walked over to Delilah with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come help me with these jars, child," she said. As they worked, she spoke quietly. "I've known Gideon Maddox for 15 years. He's a good man, though life's dealt him some hard blows. You're safe as a spring daisy here. Don't you ever doubt that." The woman's words were a balm, but they only deepened the mystery. What hard blows, what great sadness had driven this man into the mountains to live a life of perfect, sealed-off solitude? That night, after Gideon had retreated to his room, Delilah sat in her loft. By the light of a small lantern, she took out a small, worn notebook and a pencil, one of the few things she'd managed to bring with her. She began to sketch the wildflowers she'd seen by the stream. Drawing had always been her secret escape, something her father had mocked as a waste of time. But up here in the quiet, she felt free. As the flowers took shape on the paper, she thought about the locked trunk, Gideon's sudden coldness, and Miss Josie's warning. She was safe, yes, but she was living in a house built on secrets, and she was beginning to realize that some secrets, like a locked trunk, don't stay buried forever. Sooner or later, someone finds the key. The storm hit without warning. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the rain came down in solid gray sheets. The thunder wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that shook the little cabin to its foundations. For 2 days they were trapped inside. On the first morning, Delilah, desperate for something to do, noticed a pile of Gideon's work shirts with torn sleeves and missing buttons. She picked one up, found a needle and thread, and began to mend it. It was a simple, familiar task. Her father had never let her touch his clothes, saying her stitches were clumsy. But when Gideon saw what she was doing, he just gave a quiet nod of thanks. As she sewed and the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof, Gideon did something she never expected. He took a dusty leather-bound Bible from a high shelf. He opened it carefully, his big, calloused fingers almost clumsy with the delicate pages, and he began to read aloud. His voice was rough, hesitant. He stumbled over some of the words. "Used to know these words better," he muttered almost to himself. He read from the Psalms, his voice a low rumble against the roar of the storm. Delilah kept sewing, listening, watching his hands. They trembled, just slightly, every time he turned a page. A preacher's Bible? In the hands of a man who lived like a hermit? It didn't make any sense. The second day, a clatter at the door made them both jump. A young goat, having escaped its pen, had shoved its way inside. It stood there dripping rainwater and mud on the clean floor, looking utterly pleased with itself. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Delilah laughed. A real, genuine laugh that echoed in the small cabin. She looked at Gideon and saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Together they herded the muddy, indignant creature back outside. The shared, simple moment felt normal. It was a dangerous feeling. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was washed clean, gleaming in green. Gideon began to teach her things. Not just garden work, but real skills. He showed her how to split kindling, his hands guiding hers on the axe handle. Let the weight of the axe do the work, he'd say. No need to force it. They carried water from the creek together, morning and evening, falling into a comfortable rhythm. One afternoon he found her by the creek, sketching in her notebook. She'd been so lost in drawing a cluster of columbines that she hadn't heard him approach. She expected him to turn away, to leave her to her privacy, but he didn't. He stopped and looked over her shoulder. "You've got a good eye," he said quietly. "The way you've drawn the light on the petals. That's truth on paper." Later, he brought her several sticks of charcoal from his workshop, wrapped in a cloth. "These might serve you better," was all he said. The praise, the small gift, it emboldened her. That evening by the fire, she had to ask. The question had been growing in her mind for weeks, a persistent, thorny vine. "Mr. Maddox," she began, her voice soft, did you ever have children of your own?" The air in the cabin grew still. The fire seemed to suck all the sound from the room. He stared into the flames, his profile a mask of stone. She thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he spoke a single, broken word. "Once." He said nothing else, but the word hung in the air between them, full of a pain so vast it felt like another presence in the room. Later, when she lay in her loft, she dreamt of a small church with dark windows. Inside, a child was crying alone in a pew. She woke with tears on her own cheeks. A deep, unexplainable sorrow settled in her chest. Looking down, she saw Gideon still sitting by the dying embers of the fire, a lonely silhouette staring into the dark. Burdened by ghosts she was only just beginning to see. 3 weeks passed. Delilah grew stronger, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The mountains were healing her. One afternoon, checking the hen house, she found a red-tailed hawk tangled in old baling twine. Its wing was twisted at a bad angle, but its eyes were fierce, defiant. Her heart clenched. "Easy now," she whispered, slowly approaching it. She wrapped her shawl around the bird, carefully avoiding its sharp beak and talons, and carried it back to the cabin. "Mr. Maddox, I need help." He came out of the workshop, his eyes widening at the sight. "Bring it to the table," he said, already moving to get supplies. They worked together, his hands surprisingly gentle as he showed her how to hold the hawk still. "Not broken," he murmured, examining the wing. "Just strained." They cleaned and bandaged the injury, the hawk remaining strangely calm, as if it understood they were trying to help. When they were done, Delilah gently stroked the bird's head. Gideon watched her, his expression unreadable. "You're like that bird," he said, his voice rough. "Still got flight in you." Delilah spent the next few days tending to the hawk. She built it a small pen on the porch, brought it food and fresh water, and watched as it slowly began to heal. The day Miss Josie arrived for her next visit, the hawk was just starting to test its mended wing. Delilah was excited to show her their patient. So excited she almost missed the worried look that passed between Josie and Gideon. After admiring the hawk, Josie pulled Delilah aside. Her face, usually so cheerful, was etched with concern. "Your father's been talking, Delilah," she said, her hands fussing with the herbs in her basket. "Spreading ugly rumors in town about why Gideon's keeping you up here." She paused and met Delilah's eyes. "Shameful things. Lies." Delilah's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She thought of Gideon's unwavering respect, the careful distance he always kept. The idea that her father could twist this sanctuary into something ugly made her feel sick. After Josie left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Gideon barely touched his supper. Finally, as the fire burned low, he spoke, his voice heavy. "Reckon you ought to know something," he said, not looking at her. "Long time ago, before I came to these mountains, I was a preacher, down in Kansas. A preacher, the Bible, his trembling hands. It clicked into place. He took a ragged breath. During the war, something terrible happened. Something I couldn't." His voice broke. He couldn't finish. He just stood up, threw another log on the fire, and retreated to his room, closing the door behind him. Delilah was left alone with the crackling flames and the weight of his half-confession. A preacher who had lost his faith. A man who had run from something terrible. She looked out the window at the hawk in its pen, a dark shape against the moonlit sky. Like her, it was healing. But she was starting to understand that some wounds, the deepest ones, never fully close. They just scar over and ache whenever a storm is coming. And Delilah could feel it in the air. A storm was coming. A few days later, Miss Josie's mule rattled up the path again. But this time, her news was different. "Running Elk asked after you," she said to Gideon, her eyes watchful. "The Ute summer gathering starts tomorrow. He hopes you'll come." Gideon's whole body tensed. "Been a long time," he said quietly, staring into his teacup. "All the more reason," Josie pressed gently. She glanced at Delilah. The girl could learn something too. Running Elk's people are good people. Delilah's heart gave a little jump. Her father had always sneered at the Ute traders, pulling her away from them in town. To go to their gathering, it felt both exciting and forbidden. After a long silence, Gideon gave a slow nod. "I'd like to go," Delilah said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The next morning they set out at dawn. The ride was long, taking them deeper into the mountains than she'd ever been. As the sun began to set, they heard it, the distant rhythmic beat of a drum. Gideon led them into a sheltered valley where dozens of hide lodges stood in a wide circle. Fires danced, and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. It was beautiful and terrifying. An old man with long silver braids and a face mapped with wrinkles approached them. He smiled, and his entire face lit up. "Brother," he said, embracing Gideon in a fierce hug. "Many moons have passed." "Too many, Running Elk," Gideon replied, his voice thick with an emotion Delilah had never heard before. Running Elk turned to her, his dark eyes kind. "Welcome, young one. You are safe here." He guided her toward a group of women by a large cooking fire. "Go. Help with the meal. There are stories to be heard there." Delilah looked at Gideon, who nodded his encouragement. A woman with laugh lines around her eyes handed her a spoon and showed her how to stir the bubbling stew. The women spoke to her, teaching her the names of herbs, their movements graceful and sure. As night fell, the valley came alive. Children played, elders told stories, and young men and women danced to the relentless, powerful beat of the drum. Delilah watched Gideon. He sat with Running Elk and the other elders. He didn't speak much, but he was relaxed, at ease. No one here looked at him with fear or suspicion. They looked at him with love, like a brother who had finally come home. A woman beside her, named Singing Bird, noticed her watching. "Your father," she said, nodding toward Gideon, her English careful. "He was a good friend to our people. Before the great sadness." Before the great sadness. There it was again, the shadow of his past. Later that night, as the moon cast a silver glow over the valley, Delilah felt a sense of peace she had never known. Surrounded by the warmth of the fires and the quiet dignity of these people, she saw a different way to live. A life not built on judgment and fear, but on community and respect. She finally understood why Gideon had chosen the mountains. He hadn't run away from the world. He had run toward the only part of it that had ever felt like home. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of that same feeling herself. It was a fragile, tender thing, but it was there. Hope. The next morning, Running Elk beckoned them to his lodge. He sat on a woven blanket, preparing a long-stemmed pipe with deliberate, reverent movements. "Sit," he said. "Share breath and story with an old man." He lit the pipe and passed it to Gideon, the sweet-smelling smoke curling into the cool morning air. Then he looked at Delilah, his eyes seeming to see right through her. "I see something in you, young one," he said, "like embers waiting for wind." He thought for a moment. "Little fire who waits. That is your name among us." Tears pricked Delilah's eyes. A name that meant promise, not shame. Running Elk turned his gaze to Gideon. "Brother, the girl should know. A truth carried alone is a heavy stone. Shared, it becomes a path." Gideon's face tightened with a pain so profound it was hard to watch. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken thing. "I had a wife once," he began. "Sarah Walking Star. She was, she was Running Elk's niece." The connection hit Delilah like a physical blow. "Of course. We met when I was preaching in Kansas," Gideon continued, his voice trembling. "She taught me more about God's love than any book. We had a son, Joseph." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He had his mama's eyes." The smile vanished. "During the war, things got bad. Folks started seeing enemies everywhere. White against Indian. Brother against brother." Running Elk nodded gravely. "Dark times." "Sarah and Joseph were at a church in town." Gideon's voice cracked. "A church that welcomed Indians. A church I was supposed to be preaching at, but I'd stayed behind to help a sick neighbor." He closed his eyes as if to block out the memory. "Raiders came, men from the town who hated that we welcomed Sarah's people. They said the church was harboring traitors." Delilah's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. "They barred the doors," Gideon whispered, the words like shards of glass, "and they set it ablaze." The horror of it was absolute. It wasn't just a random act of war. It was targeted. It was personal. 23 souls, he said, his voice hollow. "My wife, my son. They burned." He looked up, his eyes filled with a grief so immense Delilah felt she might drown in it. "I couldn't preach after that." The words turned to ash in my mouth. "I came to these mountains to die. But this land, Sarah's land, it wouldn't let me." Running Elk placed a hand on his shoulder. "Grief teaches us compassion, brother. You have learned its lessons well." They sat in silence. The terrible truth finally laid bare. The locked trunk in the loft, it must hold what was left of Sarah and Joseph. A life sealed away, a grief too heavy to speak of. Now she understood. Gideon hadn't bought a girl to be his servant. He had seen a child in pain, a child being cast out by a cruel world, and he had done the only thing his broken heart knew how to do. He had offered sanctuary. He hadn't been buying a replacement for what he'd lost. He was trying to save someone else. The journey back to the cabin felt different. The shared knowledge of Gideon's past settled between them, not as a weight, but as a quiet understanding. The peace of the last few weeks felt real, solid, until they saw it. As the cabin came into view, Gideon pulled his horse to a sharp halt. Nailed to the porch post, a piece of white paper fluttered in the breeze. A telegram. "Stay here," Gideon said, his voice tight. He dismounted and walked to the porch. He ripped the paper free. As he read it, his jaw clenched and all the color drained from his face. He walked back and handed it to her without a word. Her hands shook as she read the stark black letters. "Jed Boone arriving next week. Demands return of daughter. Sheriff Wells en route to enforce." The fragile peace shattered. The world tilted on its axis. Her father was coming. "I won't go back," she said, the words fierce, torn from her throat. "I won't." Gideon looked at her, his eyes dark with a resolve she'd never seen before. "No," he said, his voice like the grinding of stones. "You won't." That evening Gideon sat on the porch, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing of a whetstone on his axe blade filling the twilight. It was the sound of preparation, the sound of a promise, the sound of a man who had lost one family and would be damned if he was going to lose another. The next few days were a blur of tense activity. They worked, not speaking of what was coming, but it was in every action. Then Miss Josie arrived, her mule loaded with more than just herbs. She carried the latest edition of the Whetstone Weekly. Page 3, she said, handing the paper to Gideon. He read the headline aloud, his voice filled with disbelief. The Mountain Preacher and the Girl He Redeemed. The article told of a man shattered by loss who found purpose in saving a lost soul. It told of a girl, cast aside by her own blood, who found her worth not in a town's judgment, but in the quiet dignity of the mountains. It spoke of healing, of respect, of kindness. It was beautiful. It was powerful. And it was true. Gideon looked at Delilah, his eyes wide with a question. She twisted her apron. I wrote it, she whispered. I sent it with Josie last time. I thought people needed to hear the truth before he came. A slow smile spread across Miss Josie's face. And they are hearing it, child. The whole town's buzzing. Changes the story a bit, doesn't it? Gideon carefully folded the newspaper and tucked it into his shirt pocket like a holy relic. So long as it's true, he said softly. Every word, Delilah promised. Josie's visit also brought a warning. Your pa isn't coming alone. He's gathered a few men, telling them lies about a stolen daughter and a dangerous mountain hermit. Let him come, Gideon said, his voice flat and hard. Truth stands its ground. The day came. Dust clouds on the trail. Delilah saw them first from the garden, her blood turning to ice. They're coming. Gideon emerged from the barn. Miss Josie, who had stayed to help, stood on the porch, her arms crossed. 2 riders, then a wagon, her father, and a man with a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his vest. Jed Boone stormed into the yard. There's my wayward girl, living in sin with this mountain filth. Gideon stepped between them. The girl's safe. There's no sin here. The sheriff, a man Delilah didn't recognize, pulled out a folded paper. Got a warrant here, says different, Maddox. Says you took her, kidnapping a minor. That's a lie, Delilah cried, stepping forward. He saved me. You sold me, Pa, like I was cattle. The crack of her father's hand across her face echoed in the unnaturally quiet yard. She stumbled back, the taste of blood in her mouth. Gideon let out a roar of fury and lunged, but Miss Josie grabbed his arm. Don't, Gideon! It's what they want! The sheriff smirked. These papers say the girl's yours, Jed. That makes you a kidnapper, Maddox. But just as he spoke, another figure emerged from the trees. Silent, powerful, running elk. He walked into the center of the yard, his presence commanding immediate attention. Your valley laws have no power here, Running Elk said, his voice calm but carrying immense authority. These mountains fall under treaty lands. This man, he pointed to Jed, is a trespasser. The sheriff's face reddened. Now see here, Indian. I see a father who throws away his child, Running Elk cut him off. And I see a lawman who serves money, not justice. The sheriff's patience snapped. He drew his pistol. That's enough. Maddox, you're under arrest. The girl goes with her pa. No, Delilah screamed. Jed grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the bruise from before. The sheriff advanced on Gideon with handcuffs. And Gideon did nothing. He stood still, his eyes locked on Delilah, and let the cold metal snap around his wrists. Get in the wagon, girl, Jed snarled, shoving her. She was forced onto the hard seat, tears streaming down her face. She watched as they tied the reins of Gideon's horse to the sheriff's saddle horn, leading him away like an animal. The truth will come out, Delilah, Gideon shouted, his voice strong despite the chains. Stay strong, Running Elk raised a hand. We will not forget, he called. The wagon lurched forward, carrying her back down the mountain, away from her home, away from the only person who had ever shown her kindness. Ahead lay the town, the jail, her father's ranch, and a future that felt darker than any night she had ever known. She had been found, only to be lost all over again. The bunkhouse was a cage, same rough walls, same barred window, same musty smell of straw and despair. Her father locked the door from the outside, the heavy click of the bolt sealing her fate. Sleep was impossible. The next morning he threw a stiff, too tight dress through the door. Make yourself presentable. We're going to church. The wagon ride was a silent, suffocating ordeal. As they pulled up to the white steepled church, A wealthy widow named Margaret Prescott greeted them, her voice dripping with saccharine sympathy. "Oh, Jed, how blessed we are that you've brought your dear, lost child back to the fold." Inside, the whispers were like snakes slithering through the pews. Scandal. That mountain man. Poor Jed. The preacher's sermon on prodigal children felt like a personal attack. Delilah stared at her lap, fighting back tears, refusing to give them the satisfaction. And then, just as the final hymn began, the church doors creaked open. In walked Miss Josie, her back ramrod straight. Behind her, to the gasps of the congregation, came Running Elk. And behind him were Tom Wheeler from the general store, Sarah Mills from the boarding house, and 3 other townspeople who had been there that day. They filed into the back pew, their silent presence a thunderous accusation. During a pause in the singing, Tom Wheeler's voice cut through the stuffy air. "Ain't right. Selling your own blood, then claiming theft." The whispers started again, but the tune had changed. "I remember that day. Traded her for a rifle." Jed's face was a thundercloud. He practically dragged Delilah from the church, but Widow Prescott, her face now a mask of confusion and doubt, was stopped by Miss Josie. "Margaret," Josie said quietly, "we need to talk about what really happened to this child." That night, a different key turned in the bunkhouse lock. It was Miss Josie. "Quickly, child. We're getting you somewhere safe." They crept through the darkness to a hidden wagon. An older woman, Widow Talland, helped Delilah in and covered her with a quilt. "The circuit judge will be here in 2 days," Josie whispered as they rolled away. "He'll hear everything. Your father may have the local sheriff in his pocket, but we have something better. We have the truth." They took her to Widow Talland's small, warm house on the edge of town. There was a real bed, fresh water, and on a small desk by the window, her drawing paper and charcoal sticks. Miss Josie had saved them. Delilah picked up a piece of charcoal, her fingers trembling. 2 days. 2 days until she would have to stand up and speak. For Gideon. For herself. She was little fire who waits, and she was done waiting. It was time to burn. The town hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Delilah sat between Miss Josie and Widow Talland, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Judge Harrison, a man with a face like carved oak, slammed his gavel down. The sound cracked like a rifle shot. "This court will hear testimony regarding the custody of Delilah Boone." The Crooked Valley sheriff swaggered forward, presenting papers he claimed proved Jed's guardianship. Delilah's heart sank. They looked so official. But then Miss Josie stood. "Your Honor, I present the Whetstone Weekly." She handed the judge the newspaper. An article written by Delilah herself, describing the public sale that every soul in this room knows took place. Tom Wheeler jumped to his feet. "I was there. He traded her for a Winchester and 3 sacks of flour, called her unfit." A chorus of voices from the crowd echoed his words. Jed's face turned purple. "It was a lesson to teach an ungrateful child." "A lesson?" Widow Talland's quiet voice cut through his blustering. She rose, a figure of quiet dignity. "Mr. Boone, I have seen you lock that child away like an animal. I have seen you parade her shame for your own gain. The only lesson you teach is cruelty." The room fell silent. Before Jed could sputter a response, Running Elk stepped forward. He carried an old rolled leather tube. "I present treaty documents signed by the territorial governor," he said, his voice resonating with ancient authority. He unrolled the documents on the judge's desk. "The land where Gideon Maddox lives is protected Ute territory. Jed Boone's grazing claims on that land are, and have always been, illegal. He is a trespasser. He has no authority there." The judge stared at the maps, his eyes wide. The crooked sheriff began to sweat. "Furthermore," Running Elk continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "Gideon Maddox is known to our people as a man of honor. He was married to my kinswoman, Sarah Walking Star, before war and hatred took her from us. He has every right to live on that land, and every right to offer sanctuary to those in need." The revelation of Gideon's marriage into the Ute tribe, spoken aloud in a court of law, landed like a thunderclap. It recontextualized everything. He wasn't an outsider. He was family. Judge Harrison looked up, peering over his spectacles at Jed. Mr. Boone, this treaty invalidates your entire claim. And these multiple, credible witnesses to a public transaction, they raise serious questions about your fitness as a guardian. You can't believe them, Jed roared. I can and I do, the judge snapped back. He shuffled the papers, his face grim. The entire room held its breath. He looked directly at Delilah. For the first time, the eyes of the town were on her, not with pity or scorn, but with sympathy, with respect. This court finds, the judge declared, his voice booming, that Jed Boone surrendered all parental rights through his cruel and public actions. His claims are baseless. His authority is non-existent. He looked at Delilah again, and his expression softened. Young lady, you are free. You are free to choose your own path. The gavel fell, a sound of finality, a sound of justice. Jed Boone stormed from the hall, a man defeated by the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Delilah didn't watch him go. She fell into Miss Josie's arms, tears of relief, of victory, finally streaming down her face. She was free. Later that afternoon, from the courthouse steps, Judge Harrison banished Jed Boone from Whetstone and stripped the crooked sheriff of his badge. The town watched as the two men who had built their power on lies slunk away in disgrace. Miss Josie walked into the jail and unlocked Gideon's cell. Time to go home, she said. Gideon walked out into the golden afternoon light. He saw Delilah waiting for him on the steps of the church. She stood with Miss Josie, her face shining. He stopped at the bottom step and simply held out his hand, giving her the choice. She didn't take his hand. She flew down the steps and threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his worn jacket. You're the only father I want, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He froze for a heartbeat. Then his arms came up and held her tight. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his throat working, no words needed. Miss Josie smiled, wiping a tear from her eye. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, filled with a peace that felt deep and permanent. When they reached the clearing, the cabin was waiting, a true home. While Gideon saw to the horses, Delilah went to check on the hawk. The bird lay still in its nest on the porch. Its fight was over. It had passed peacefully. Together they buried the hawk in a quiet spot near the garden. As the sun set, Gideon looked at the small grave. You set it free, he said, his voice rough. Delilah looked up at him, her eyes clear. It set me free too. She reached for his hand, and this time he took it, his fingers lacing through hers. They stood together as the first stars pricked the purple sky, a father and daughter, bound not by blood, but by something far stronger. Choice, respect, love. The locked trunk still sat in the loft, but it was no longer a secret dividing them. It was a memory they now shared, a testament to the sorrow that had, in a strange and winding way, brought them both to this place of healing. In the months that followed, the cabin became something more. Delilah, the girl no one wanted, started a school on the porch. Children from the town and children from the Ute tribe came, learning their letters and numbers together, erasing the lines of hatred their parents had drawn. Running Elk brought stories, and Miss Josie brought books. Delilah's own stories, the ones she wrote on paper, found their way to a newspaper in Denver. They called her a voice of the mountains, a teller of truths. She wrote of healing, of forgiveness, and of how community can grow in the rockiest of soil. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, she sat by the fire, reading her latest story aloud to Gideon. He listened, carving a small wooden horse for one of the children, a quiet smile on his face. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of pine and baking bread. It was a sanctuary. She wrote in her journal that night, the pen flowing smoothly across the page. She wrote about the children, about the changing seasons, about the steady, quiet love that had healed her. Her final sentence was the simplest, truest thing she had ever written. He didn't buy me, she wrote. He brought me home. Gideon came and stood behind her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow blanket the world outside, erasing the old tracks and making everything new. Two broken souls who had found a way to be whole again, not despite their scars, but because of them. Home was not a place you were born into. It was a place you built, word by word, day by day, until you belonged. At last. Thank you for listening to this story. Stories are powerful, they connect us, and they can change the way we see the world. If you felt that connection today, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know when the next story might be the one you need to hear.